Welcome everybody to this week's session of Occupation Education. So this week is supposed to be part 2 of strategic campaign planning. For those of you who were here back when the series started, we had Dr. Gordon Lafer from the Labor Education Research Center come and give us a 5-hour training on strategic campaign planning. He kind of laid out why people engage in the strategic campaign process, what's involved in that, how to determine capacity. He also touched on how to build numbers once you know what your campaign is. And this week he was supposed to come back, and the plan was that by then we would have some actual campaign proposals on the table, and we would take what he gave us in that first training and try to apply them to our real world actual proposals that were hopefully going to be on the table. So we've got the real world campaign proposals now on the table, but unfortunately a couple days ago Gordon's wife had to have spinal surgery and a medical emergency, and he had to cancel at the last minute. We tried to get one of his labor colleagues to replace him, and we weren't able to do that. So after a lengthy phone conversation with him, I kind of picked his brain on what he was planning to do tonight, and with the help of Michael, Kerrigan, and Jamil, and John will probably jump up and help too, we're going to try to sort of recreate what was on Gordon's agenda and add to it a little bit on our own. And the general premise of it was to kind of go over the highlights of what we learned at session 1, and then the handouts you received are a spreadsheet that John put together of all of the current actual campaign proposals, and we've broken them down into different categories which the proposal submittees helped to did help in fact fill them out. So most of these answers are in their words, or they've at least reviewed what we filled in for them. And so the general idea is to try to look at these campaign proposals through the lens of strategic campaign planning. And then I think there is some talk about how we can potentially add a few things to these proposals, potentially, in aid of the discussion. And at the conclusion of the session, we want to get some feedback from everybody. Right now, the plan is to have 2 more General Assemblies where strategic planning and our campaign proposals are going to be discussed and decided on. And so one of the things we'd like to get from you at the end of tonight's session is what other questions are left unanswered for you with regard to the current proposed campaigns that we're supposed to be choosing in another week or 2. Originally, the plan was to have the General Assembly make a decision at this Friday's GA. It just seemed like that was going to be too fast for folks, that more time was going to be needed for discussion and fleshing things out. And so the revised proposal is at this Friday's GA is just going to be a discussion. People can ask questions again, but the idea is to start tossing out ideas, concerns, yays or nays, and then on the next Tuesday, hopefully we're going to have indoor GA, and the discussion will be about capacity, how many campaigns can we effectively do, as well as some other discussion. And then at Friday's GA...
No, the next Tuesday, indoors again.
Okay, so the next Tuesday, do you remember the number date of it?
15th.
The 15th is our anticipated date to try and come to a consensus within the Assembly on which campaign or campaigns we want to focus on for the next 6 months.
And we'll post that schedule online on the campaign page that has the campaign plans themselves.
Yeah, but definitely help us circulate the word and make sure that folks that you're working with know of these dates and time schedules.
Are they period closed?
Yes.
To submit campaigns?
Yeah.
So yes, the period to actually submit new proposals for this cycle has passed. But again, this is only a 6-month cycle, so there's no harm in starting to put together something for the next cycle and really get it tight and fleshed out by that next time period if you want.
Mary just let me know that, just in case anybody doesn't know, there's now a restarted occupation, essentially, at the federal building. And so, yeah, last night's GA was held there. Mary thinks they may have agreed to have all of the GAs there. Does anybody have more information? Because we kind of thought it would be good to have these conversations indoors where we can easily do things like this. So we would just like to know if anybody knows.
I don't know whether or not the consent stuff, but I know they were talking about it. I was watching by live stream, and there was a proposal that they have them all there so long as there's people there.
Well, what they can consent in one meeting can be altered the next, right?
Okay, so I don't think that changes our schedule. We'll just do the best we can with whatever location those dates are at.
Okay, so with that being said, should we just kind of go over a few of the highlights from, so these are my, the session with Gordon, for those of you that weren't there, was not allowed to be recorded. It's our only training session that was not recorded. And so my notes are probably the only recollection of the session that exists, unfortunately. I have notes. Oh, I would love to combine them with mine.
Yeah.
And there's
And
no
feel free to
trouble
chime in
over
if you recall something differently than what I had.
Over there, yeah.
So the session started off with
Can you
talk.
back this to the camera then?
Okay. So the session started off with a discussion about how to come up with a plan between now and the next 6 months, basically, for Occupy Eugene. And the idea was that you should make the plan challenging enough that it's not going to be easily met, but not so ambitious that there's no way of attaining at least even mini victories for morale purposes and effectiveness purposes. And so the agenda for this training session was what kind of goals make sense for this year, how many people will be needed to achieve those goals, what tools organizers might use to be able to figure out what the end game looked like, how to assess targets in those campaigns, and how to make a coordinated 6-month campaign plan. And so we did a bunch of exercises that we won't have to go over all of these. We came up with some potential goals and talked about how to evaluate a goal. And two of the primary issues that you need to use in order to figure out what the group has capacity to do is how many people do you have to have in order to potentially achieve this goal or to win that campaign. And he said how many people or how many serious activists would you need, meaning people who are really willing to commit to rowing the boat and not just standing at the dock and waving you in. And then the second component was how many people could you get tomorrow to come and work on this campaign? And this is twofold, really. One is, how many people do you have the capacity to actually bring in and work on the campaign? But the other thing to think about when looking at campaigns in terms of Part B is it sexy? Is it fun? Is it going to be engaging? Does it speak to people so that they will want to commit their free time and energies to working on that campaign? So we then went through a few just sample campaigns that we kind of made up at the time. They weren't really based on any actual proposals, but, so we threw up a, stop foreclosures, basically, just to use as an example. And when asked how many people would you need to win that, the number was 200 to 1,000 people would need to show up to be able to defend homes or to be able to stop foreclosures in Lane County. And when we assessed how many people were available right now, 40 to 50 people was the top, meaning we had a long way to go before we would be able to manage capacity with that. Shut down the Bank of America.
So I'm a little confused on those numbers, because you said how many people would be needed to be seriously involved. And so I want to check if that 200 to 100 number was seriously involved, or as it says, how many people show up at the home, which is a different...
Well, 200 to 1,000, and part of the reason that the folks that put that up there thought that encompassed serious activists was because it involved potentially getting arrested.
Okay.
And so you would have to be seriously committed to that campaign in order to choose to be arrested.
Okay. Thanks.
Shut down Bank of America, or make it unprofitable to operate in Eugene. They thought 90 activists, at least initially, to get the campaign going, and they thought they had about 30 now. House people by squatting. They thought 300 people roughly needed, and they had 25 to 30 now, meaning less than 10% of the number they needed.
Sorry, I want to go back again.
Uh-huh.
What was the thinking behind it takes 200 to 1,000 people willing to be arrested to stop one house from being foreclosed, which it seems to me is only, there's only should be a showdown with the police a limited number of times before we stop that foreclosure, versus shutting down Bank of America only requiring 90.
Well, so the first one was stopping foreclosures in Lane County entirely.
Oh, okay. So the issue wasn't just we need 200 to 1,000 to show up once willing to be
Right.
arrested. We need 200 to 1,000 willing to show up
To
many
actually
times.
stop the whole thing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And then this next one, the Bank of America one, each person who threw out the idea also kind of threw out the numbers, so there's going to be some differences based on
Right.
just, individual
Right.
assessment. But then just to show you when Joe brought up the homeless shelter tent city issue, he believed that you would need about 20,000 people to support the campaign, 1,000 to defend it, and that maybe there were 100 ready to go. Meaning once again that maybe there were 10% of what we would need capacity-wise.
Right. But the 1K defendant is analogous to the 200 to 1,000.
Exactly. Yeah. And then we did that with a few other ones. I think the general theme to point out, though, is that with all of these potential campaigns, hey, the heat's on.
What's this?
Someone stuck their hand through a hole and all of a sudden started working. The point to make with this is that with all of these campaigns, the general agreement with this group that was there was that for all of them we had less than 10% of what we would need to actually fulfill, which means we would have to increase our capacity by 90% in order to achieve any single one of these campaigns, which I think for a lot of us was significant, especially if you think about trying to do all of these campaigns. Then we talked about where are we going to get activists from. Oh, and if you look up here, one of the things that Gordon emphasized is that we really need to be honest with ourselves about what our actual numbers are and what our ability to bring in additional people really is when we're doing these assessments. So he taught us how to use this grid. And how you use it is, on the left-hand side are all the different types of categories of activists that might exist. And across the top is how many people you want to bring in from each category. So you want to bring in 100 homeless activists, 100 seniors, et cetera, et cetera. Once you decide, and each campaign, of course, you're going to have different numbers for these groups. Like the tent city is probably going to have a lot more homeless activists interested than, say, college students. But the Foreclosure Bank of America one is probably going to have more homeowners or unions or other groups than otherwise. And then really what you're supposed to do is come up with a plan where you have the months of the year laid out, and each committee basically pledges to bring in a certain number of activists. And if we agree that, let's say, the Legal Research Committee is going to bring in 50 new people to the movement, then each one of us has to say, I'm going to find 10 people and bring them into the movement, and I'm going to be their escort. I'm going to call them before actions, I'm going to call them before meetings, I'm going to greet them at the door and make sure they feel comfortable, I'm going to plug them in and try to really, get them involved. And this is something that has to be refined constantly, and it's essential to build commitment and trust among new folks in order to keep them involved. We don't need people to just sign a petition or pledge to support us. We need people to show up and actually put their brains to work with us in forming better campaign plans.
There's one point that I wanted to make about this particular part, and it's with the way the recruitment method of people that he was talking about. And Lauren just mentioned that we're not asking people to sign a petition, maybe for the campaign, maybe that's not what we should be doing. But I think one thing to point out about that that Gordon really didn't mention is that Occupy, at least in my opinion, when we're talking about campaign plans, this is something I really think people should understand, is that Occupy is really different than a lot of other movements. We may have a particular focus, we may have a particular strategic campaign objective, like say it's foreclosures or say it's banks. But one of the things that we agreed on in that session, and that's not necessarily agreed upon in the whole Occupy organization, but it was that whatever we chose had to be really connected to the broader message of Occupy Wall Street, which really focuses on inequality at 99%. The banks, of course, to some extent. But I think the big rallying cry at this point has certainly been around inequality. And so the idea was not to lose focus on that. And one of the things I would argue when you're doing this recruitment, if we actually do something like canvassing door to door, is that you're not going to be tied to, in a certain sense, to a particular goal. And for people, like for example, if you're going to the door and talking to someone, you'd have to say, well, we just want to close Bank of America for this one day next month. You wouldn't say that, right? Because the idea is this is an action. The purpose of the action is to build solidarity, to build community connections, to build up our numbers. So that then it may be one action that we do, but we're not. We fully understand that we need to organize in a longer term way, right? And to actually bring people in, like that. Our campaign, in other words, has a strategic focus and a goal, but we're not. There's obviously a pretty deep issues, and so the idea is this is something that should be easier to recruit people on, right? Because you're not just asking them for their attention this month on one particular issue that really, isn't the idea necessarily, or doesn't have to be, I would argue, just because, Occupy, it's just not like other movements in a lot of ways. I think the reason a lot of people are involved, for example, is because it really does address such a broad range of issues, or at least sees some pretty complicated, difficult issues, especially around inequality, even around the banks. These are like some of the most powerful institutions in our society at this point. Just think about all the bailouts and the amount of people from Goldman Sachs and Bank of America and the administration of Obama, who's supposed to be a liberal president, is supposed to bring these folks in. Well, obviously that hasn't happened. So, this method that Gordon discussed, where, say, you had 15 people actively involved in a particular campaign, and the onus was on those 15 people each to find 10 other people, say, for a particular action or a particular event. That kind of organizing method comes out of union organizing and helping unions organize strategic campaign plans, but we don't necessarily have to wed ourselves to the precise methods. You know, it's a really good idea, but especially, you know, how we go about articulating, you know, what we're trying to do to the community. Because we don't want to, I think one of the concerns is we don't want to box ourselves in and make people think that, oh, you know, we're Occupy Eugene and, you know, we're in solidarity with Occupy Wall Street, but we're really trying to tackle this foreclosure issue, and that's really what we're concerned about exclusively. No one really wants to do that necessarily, but we do realize that we have a certain capacity, and initially at least, we can focus on X or Y issue. But our broader goal is to bring people into the fold and say, look, you know, this is something that if we really want to change, we really need your involvement. We're not asking for your money, we're not asking for your signature, you know, we're not asking for your you know, single day participation necessarily. We really want your involvement, your perspective, you know, your actual solidarity. And that message could be articulated not just to individuals, but also to groups that we organize with. And as we get into some of these, we have a really fantastic survey that John helped to make up, where we just asked some crucial questions of each of the different campaigns. And hopefully that's something we can get you to see how some people answer these questions. But I think there's some brilliant answers, because they're not easy. They're not easy things to try to deal with. So anyway, it's just about that point, because this issue of the number of people was like very, in my sense, I don't know if anyone else would agree that it was there, but it seemed to me that it was a pretty crucial part of Gordon's talk. So I could be wrong, but that seemed like it was very important when I was listening to it.
John, did you want to?
Yeah, so I wasn't at that first strategic campaign thing with Gordon. So I'm wondering if then, or if anybody wants to speak to after I do, the distinction or relationship between root level objectives and the objective of a 6-month campaign. This was one of the most exciting things to me about Max Rameau's talk when he came to speak here in the education series, where he said they had, you know, all kinds of different campaigns they were doing, but the goal wasn't just to get this home put into a community land trust, or that home put into a community land trust, or this area, no more foreclosures. Each of those, you know, has value in its own right, obviously, but their group had identified root level objectives that are less clear in a way, but that tie together, you know, many actions, and that I think help to address what Jamil was saying about keeping in people's awareness. We're not just focused on this one little thing. We have some big issues we're trying to address. So Max Rameau's example was, we're going to stop this house being foreclosed on, but we're doing that in service toward getting everybody to recognize housing as a human right and community control over land. So this is why on the spreadsheet, one of the questions we asked for each campaign was, what are your root level objectives? The things that you aren't going to accomplish within the 6 months, but that can be part of the messaging with the campaign, and might be messaging of other actions that occupiers are taking outside of that campaign. People may be doing other things that still connect to that same root level objective, and that way we can be hitting that point in the media over and over again,
Right.
And continue it, you know, with future campaigns. Now, I expect over time we'll identify a number of root level objectives that we all look at and go, yeah, these are the kinds of things that we're moving toward.
Great.
Just a quick note to the people on the live stream who don't have copies of the survey. I was able to get it up online, and we're going to show it on the live stream as we get to the discussion. Because I think it will be useful to, we're not critiquing these proposals, but I do think it's interesting for the purpose of this discussion to kind of see how they answer some of these questions, because that's a great point.
I also just want to say, not every column, not every campaign finished filling it out. I only found out this morning that we were going to probably want this today, so I didn't get to make sure that every campaign had answered those. But we'll try to get it fully filled out as quickly as possible, and make sure that a link to that is available through all the usual ways online.
Looks like Jeremy didn't get contacted. Maybe?
Jeremy, and he got contacted, but you know, my intention was to follow up with each of them individually and make sure.
Yeah,
And
like,
Ruth also.
Yeah, Ruth got filled out some.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so,
Sorry, one more thing. I just also want to say myself, looking at the answers, it seems to me that some of the people proposing the campaigns, you know, I might help them to understand some of the questions better. So I feel like this is really an opportunity for all of us to learn, you know, more about this.
all right. So the next section of the discussion that we spent a lot of time on is why should we focus on a particular campaign or a set of campaigns. And basically what Gordon tried to emphasize is that it's incredibly hard to win. You know, you're up against corporations, you're up against government, you're up against huge obstacles, and the idea that you could even win a single campaign or a single issue would be an incredibly challenging outcome. And so, you know, he basically said any of these goals or issues will be hard to win. And especially with the number of people that we have right now. He thinks that 2 campaigns would be the maximum that Occupy Eugene would be capable, or that most movements or organizations would be capable of pulling off successfully. These are quotes from him, but any more than 2 would be to piss away energy on many fronts, or be an organization that takes positions on things but doesn't want to win on a particular issue and goal. And, you know, just to flesh that out, I mean, basically what he's saying is, you know, there's 2 different kinds of organizations. There are those that are positional, you know, organizations where they'll say, we're pro-pot, pro-choice, you know, anti-jails and prisons, and you might have a protest saying each one of those things, but you're not actually working to legalize pot, protect the right to choice, or close jails and prisons. You're just sort of like presenting the issues and trying to educate people, versus organizations or campaigns that attempt to actually make systemic change, or, you know, actually try to achieve a tangible result.
I just want to say, I feel like that's belittling a little to say like piss away or what they want or are attempting. I mean, I think when people get out on the streets in front of Bank of America, they want Bank of America to shut down. I think the question is just what's actually going to be effective, you know. And I think on that level, I you know, basically agree with you.
Okay. So then he basically said that he thought it was going to be a serious attempt at having enough power to win or change one thing. It's going to take everyone we can get to just do one of those things. Then he asked, you know, what should the criteria be for choosing that campaign, and what process do we use to make choosing the process inclusive and fair? Which obviously we've been trying to incorporate into all of these different GAs and stuff like that. He did mention, you know, even if somebody is working on the gardening committee, and guerrilla gardening does not become the campaign that is chosen, that, you know, people should understand why it's important to have a fair and democratic process in choosing our campaign. And sometimes that might require people to either give up their favorite thing for the good of the movement, or at least be willing to work on something that might not be their pet project at that time period. Then, you know, we kind of went around the group. These are just all, you know, different people's opinions, which we don't necessarily need to go over right now, but there was a lengthy discussion. Gordon also, if you see Gordon's comments here, he was the one that reminded us that, you know, it's important for us to go back to the unifying feeling of the encampment, when everybody was focused on survival, and, you know, one thing that was a high priority of almost everyone. Every committee had some role to play in making that, you know, exist. We were a very tight-knit community at that time. And, you know, as I mentioned the other week, despite the fact that we all worked really hard to keep that camp alive, there was also a number of people who were concerned that, you know, we weren't protesting the banks. We weren't doing a lot of the other things that people wanted to work on because we were so focused on that campaign to keep the camp alive. And so that's kind of a reality when you pick a campaign that sometimes works, you know, happens that other things kind of have to take back seats. The criteria for picking goals to focus on, we've kind of gone over that before. I'm not going to belabor that because we've published that. But basically, you know, he said, what is the right fight to pick? You want, you know, you don't want something, you don't want to lowball it, but you really want to make sure that what you choose is going to grow the movement immediately. And as the movement grows, you can get more militant while building the movement so that you have the numbers when you take on more militant tactics as push comes to shove to win a campaign. And what he meant by that is you can't take new people and immediately expect them to blockade the police department or something like that. You know, you have to start off doing educational events, holding signs in Bank of America, getting people up to speed and on board with what you're doing. And as they feel more empowered and more comfortable and more committed to the cause, then you can increase your tactics. If letter writing doesn't work, then you go to the city council. If going to the city council doesn't work, then maybe you go to Polling's home, you know. So the whole idea was you can't jump levels and be successful at it. You can't go from 0 to 100 and expect to be successful. And in fact, often what that would do is actually... I'm facing my notes. I don't want to stare at the camera. Okay, thanks. So anyway, the point was that there are ways to do it and not to do it in order to grow the movement, and growing the movement has to be one of the priorities given our lack of capacity to win right now. Okay, so so I think that's basically it from the notes. I guess before we dive into these handouts and actually discussing these, is there any discussion or questions regarding just sort of the background about why we choose campaigns or why we would focus on a goal or anything like that?
Well, I just wanted to check on the last, was the point you were about to make is that if we jump up that escalation thing too quickly, we risk backlash?
Well, not only backlash, but potentially losing numbers instead of growing.
Right. People are like, why did you jump to doing this outrageous thing when all you had done was send a letter or nothing?
Yeah, right. You know, I mean, like in the environmental scene that I'm most familiar with, you know, before you go and lock down to a ranger station, you've sent in your comments, you've done a lot of media, you've done outreach to the local communities, you've done everything you can so that if you are forced to engage in civil disobedience and get arrested, you can stand in court and say, we tried every means possible to do this in the legal way, and when we were totally ignored and shut out of the process, then we had to take this other step. To jump over those steps, you know, in some ways, can be perceived as almost discrediting us in some ways.
I just want to know that Derek Jensen was quoted on that. There was an article about anarchy putting down the black bloc that got a lot of attention, you know, a while ago. And you know, I think a lot of us had issues with some of it, but it really struck me that Derek Jensen, you know, who was not like, you know, he wants us to be pushy when we need to be pushy. If you've read it, you know that. But he was like, you know, you don't go straight to, you know, destroying stuff and whatever. You need to be able to, you know, like she said, to be able to tell people, yeah, look, we went through the channels. Yeah.
And I think also too, knowing who you're dealing with. Like California Work has a program in Springfield and Eugene. It takes lots of different organizing tactics. And the timeline is much different in Springfield than Eugene. You have to really know your community, know who you're dealing with, and be flexible. I mean, what's happening like in Springfield, they can change. Boy, it's just drive us Eugene folks. We'd lose our patience, but it's how you have to go.
So you escalate more slowly there because
Yes.
your sense is the population is more conservative, and
Yes.
they really need to see you crossed every T,
Yep, you got it.
dotted every
Even more
I.
important, yep.
Still didn't make it.
Yeah, but it's working. You can get it done.
Any other questions, comments, concerns on that part of the process? So does everybody feel like it is a valuable discussion to engage in now to actually try to apply some of that discussion to the actual campaigns that we have in these handouts?
Absolutely. That has been fun.
All right. So Jamil and John, do you want to kind of take lead with this, or Michael? So I asked Michael to be here primarily because with 30-something years of working with a nonprofit organization, he's obviously been involved in a lot of strategic campaigns and done a lot of campaign planning. So maybe before we dive into this, Michael, do you want to just kind of, give us your assessment on, I assume Calc does strategic planning and why do you do it and how does it work practically speaking on your day-to-day organizing work?
Well, you need a kind of a broad outline to always come back to. I mentioned Springfield as an example of really where it's critical. Marin Malcolm, who I've worked with for years, just laid out a plan in Springfield in terms of targeting the school district there. It was a multi-year plan, and really to be looking 5-10 years down the road, you really got to be thinking strategic. You can't keep responding to, well, this is how it's going, and have a long-term objective like that. So it's really, you can't get it done. And so I've seen her operate. I've seen it work where, Springfield changes made in that community are amazing, and it succeeded because of that one step at a time process.
Can you just give one or two examples of big successes?
Well, the school district of Springfield used to be totally run by the good old boys. White males ran that outfit. They didn't really have any multicultural education in Springfield. It really was. And now you have probably one of the most progressive superintendents in the state of Oregon. You've got the students of color, parents of color are, playing a major role now. And the main issue, the issue of the LGBTQ issue, where Springfield used to be like anti-gay big time, they had to shift around where teachers have actually come out in Springfield, which is a very challenging thing for them to do, and not only in Springfield, in Eugene as well. So changes have happened. It's just been, you see a school district that has been transformed. And even though the school board is not a progressive school board necessarily like Eugene, those changes still have happened. And there's a combination of looking, there's a Martin Luther King Day event that the group does every year where students come together, and about 1,000 students participate. Every school in Springfield takes part in it. And what it did, it's that planning process goes on year round, but it laid the foundation for when the more, for the president to make the changes. It's kind of like the group has, had the exposure. There's a Save Your Childhood event in the spring, so it's always planned where the educational events are there to form the foundation for the organizing to happen. You get the school district, the board, and the city council to make the change. So those things are integrated, and it just really works well.
And so just because Calc has chosen to create a strategic plan around that issue doesn't in any way make it so that you can't be responsive when Occupy comes to town or when some hate crime happens, or you're still allowed, or you still have the capacity to be reactive when you need to, even in the face of having a longer term campaign in the works, right?
For example, there was the Ku Klux Klan distributed some flyers in Springfield about two weeks ago, and responded within a few days, going door to door in Springfield, got the school district involved, got the neighbors, and yeah, we were able to respond very, very, quickly and get it done. But because a lot of the groundwork had been done, then we were able to respond. So it certainly does not negate being able to jump on a crisis and get people, active when needed. So.
All right.
Anything else?
So. then, looking at these handouts, did you guys want to take lead on this? I don't feel like I need to be the only talker if you wanted to.
Yeah. So I thought that there was several points that Lauren brought up in Gordon's presentation that were certainly provocative. I think John responded to a couple of them. And I think just to review a little bit, the GA yesterday agreed that they passed some kind of proposal stating that they, agreed with the idea of campaign, strategic campaign, one or more. There was even some discussion of all. But I think that when we look at some of the answers to the questions that we posed to the campaign planners, I think it's important to think about some of Gordon's criticism at the same time, and specifically his criticism of, I think the way that Max Rameau termed it was mission creep, where you're not really accomplishing much in any particular campaign because you're so dispersed. Now, before getting into that, I think we have to make an exception here with an Occupy. There was always this split aspect to Occupy from the beginning. There is obviously a social justice, inequality, sort of big finance criticism, but at the same time we had our kitchen, we had sort of a social service aspect to the organization. That still exists. I think it's a fantastic part of it. I'm in no way suggesting that all of the efforts and everything that Occupy is doing should be channeled into one particular direction. But I do think it's important to think about like how we would actually work that out. Like, for example, the Occupy Eugene Medical Committee is just doing amazing stuff. They've had medical clinics, they're doing free haircuts, they get tons of the media attention, they're doing fantastic work, I think that we all agree with. I think everybody in Occupy needs to support them in ways that we can. But I don't think that effort is mutually exclusive from developing a strategic campaign plan where we can articulate some kind of vision that includes, some of these other things going on. That said, these are difficult questions. So yeah,
I just wanted to mention that the medical, the people I'm doing the medical thing want us to be doing things like this as well. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I would say the same thing.
I just have one comment. I thought that we were in trial and error mode where anybody could try anything and then report back as to what seems to really work. Like the Kesey Square every Friday. I don't know how to report back on how that's working. Dealing directly with the police who are giving tickets to people for long space.
So just to give an example, so it's pretty clear that Occupy as an organization has several different streams of things going on. So the GA may decide that, hey, this proposal looks great. However, we have several different streams of things going on, but nobody really knows what's going on with those streams. How many people are they bringing in? What are they accomplishing? What's going on? Let's have an analysis period of the existing campaigns, and then we can make some more decisions about how we want to divvy out our energy. I'm just pointing out that, yeah, you're right, and probably very few people know what exactly is going on with that, because there is no sort of center, there's no group that's kind of analyzing this, a consistent group. So, and maybe that's a crucial component to what we decide to do. I think it's, the possibilities are open. That said, we do have to consider how does that connect to the broader OWI. What I was always emphasizing when we had these conversations is what are our principles? And so that's something that we articulated with Gordon. And I think our top three, I don't know if Lauren mentioned them, top three were building the movement, getting to the root of issues.
Win a goal with realistic resources.
Win a goal with realistic resources. right? That's what we came up with. That's not something the whole organization is necessarily wed to. But again, you know, those are things. So anyway, I won't go on and on. I'm just trying to point out, like, there's these elephants in the room that we have to really keep in mind as we're having our discussions. So I don't necessarily want to go by point, but I think the live stream we're going to get the B of A, Bankrupting America, I think was like the first one in the column. And so the questions that we wanted to ask, and so, you know, the Legal Research Committee set up a whole template for each committee, each campaign proposal group to fill in the details on. But then once we got them back, we realized that there were lots of fuzziness, maybe on certain aspects of the plans. And so we really wanted to try to nail them down and, you know, with very specific questions and say, you know, what's your answer to this?
If I can speak briefly to that. I think one example of that is root level objectives. So I mean, if somebody, the B of A, Bankrupting America, so he offers as a root level objective, build public awareness of the corrupt and damaging nature of the operations of the banking giants and how they illustrate the problems of our economy in general while building support for credit unions and a state bank. So in my mind at least, like the last bit, building support for credit unions, are establishing a state bank. Establishing a state bank is a very concrete objective. Like you could do a multi-year campaign to get a state bank established. But that one and a lot of the other ones, I think you can kind of always go deeper with the root level of objectives, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that the deeper you go, you're going to find themes that tie together more and more different things. So assuming that makes sense to anybody, so for example, you've just taken the first one, build public awareness of the corrupt and damaging nature of the operations of banking giants and how they illustrate the problems of our economy in general. What would be a root level of objective? And one way to think about that is, if you achieve that, suppose many more people are now aware of the corruption and damage from our banking giants, and many more people are clear about the problems of our economy in general. What do you get? What's the deeper thing you get if you've gotten that?
Build a community finance system.
To build a community finance system. So I mean, and even to me, even that kind of skips a step. It's like it implies you want to replace it with something else, and it might also help people think about what are the kinds of things we would want that replacement system to have. And so when you say it's going to be a community institution, it kind of quickly, in my mind, becomes analogous to community control over land. It's community control over our finance system. I think probably a lot of you know right now that, you know, when new money comes into our economy, it's basically handed to giant financial institutions to decide who to lend that new made-up money to. So assuming we end up with an economic system where we're still introducing money that gets handed out, we would probably like for the decisions about where that money gets handed to be made by the community as a whole, rather than by a few people in a small room somewhere.
No, I was trying to understand.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And anybody else think on that, or?
Yeah, I have, since money is something I would love to think about. There's also that we could develop local alternative currency, and if I got my bibliography out, I would give you even more for us to have local everything that circulates only locally.
Right, and so that, to me, that points to a whole other kind of root level of objective. I would guess most of us would agree that far too many of the important decisions in our society are made in a central way for a broad area. So a root level of objective might be to bring more decision making to the local level. Any other thoughts or questions?
Well, one other thing that I kind of noted with the root level objectives, like one thing that I was trying to look at this grid and think about is do any of these campaigns lend themselves to being merged or combined? And looking at the root level objective is a good way to see, if they have similar, end games, similar long-term goals, then that would, liken them to potentially able to be combined. And originally, I was pretty strongly in the camp of combining our Homes Over Wall Street campaign with the B of A campaign, but from the way that the root level objectives are framed with each of those, they don't really look very analogous. So I found that kind of
And looking at these documents, combining the Our Homes Over Wall Street with the Campaign for Home Solutions looks a lot more like a better fit. And I've had other people tell me the same thing.
And I would agree with that, because both really have to do with housing is a human right. And both campaigns are eventually looking towards land trusts and having a community land trust. So I think there is some general rubric to operate on. And can I say something else? Because I don't think it's been, when the camp closed, the city set up this task force, and the impetus for that really was Occupy and what they had accomplished. And the task force came out with actually 6 areas in which they consensed. And this is now, I wasn't here Monday night, so I don't know what happened at the last city council. But my feeling is that unless we stay on top of this, that nothing is going to happen. And that there's a time sensitivity to this campaign. And I think also the same thing holds for foreclosures. That's happening now and needs to be maintained now. I'm very concerned with the homeless because we are so at least initially identified with that if we let it drop, I think the community is going to let it drop. So that's just part of something I've been concerned about.
And next week, the session, the training side, we can go into more depth on that in terms of, I think we have an opportunity to really dig deep into your concern.
And I wanted to let people know that the kind of camp that we're...
No, next week is influencing the building power influencing the...
And I'd like to pass these out. These are draft community agreements. They'll give a better picture of what we're looking at. And now, this is a draft. The people who would actually determine the community agreement are the people who are living there. This is absolutely not something that's going to be imposed on.
It's self-organizing.
So there'll also be various, policies that people can set up for getting rid of people that don't fit in and so on. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, this is, I think, for bringing back to American office.
Yeah.
I'd love to get more into what the campaign for homeless solutions, but I suggest we dig deeper into it now.
Okay, so I just wanted to...
Yeah, what I was going to say overall is, I think it's great getting more focused and clear about campaigns and trying to, but like everything, it's a vortex. It's, like you said, you can go as deep as you want to go with anything. And we're feeling, we're experiencing a schism of what's urgent, what's now, and what's like more long-term kind of planning. One of the things I thought of, like, you want to target work on the bank. I know it's, multi-layered, but how we can get the reform happening with the CEOs overall, like putting a cap on their salaries, banning the bonus system, being able to really put some restrictions so that this model just doesn't run rampant like it did with the derivatives. Because now and I always say this every step of the way, I was looking at the housing market and saying this is going to be a disaster for capitalizing on people's most basic needs. And now it is such a tremendous mess. It is toxic. I mean, the derivatives and all that went out there are just intangible, basically. It's global. How we can, that's a big undertaking to try to get that, to try to unravel that mess. How we can somehow, like, did everyone see Frontline last night? The banks? Yeah, working, like how they're working more directly with CEOs and Bill Moyers had a show also with, I can't think of his name right now, but he was one of the founding members of Occupy. They're going in and talking to the insiders and having conversations with them. And, it has to be a consciousness shift with these people.
Of course, you can
No,
also
I-
buy
But I think
stock.
the more dialogue that goes on, the
Yeah.
more conversation, because
Yeah.
they're just human beings as
No,
well.
I totally agree. And when you said restrictions, I was not worried, but like, I imagined like, oh, we're going to pass a law saying, income for the high-ups can only be this multiple of the lower downs, which some countries have, and I think that can be part of the picture. But I think there are countries like, I don't know if Japan has a law like that, but it's just a cultural thing there. The CEOs don't make, 100 or 500 times what the lowest level workers are. They'd be too embarrassed to.
Right.
So I think I agree that a cultural shift is part of this picture. What? China has laws. Yeah.
Yeah, but like the way that influence the banks and stuff is to buy stock in them and then go into the meetings and then you have a say. You can have a say as to how much money the CEO gets. But we as outsiders don't have that. So then just buy stock, $7 for a stock in Wells Fargo, one share gets you into the meeting. That's what people are
Doesn't get you
doing.
voting, though.
So I agree that that's
one
a
tactic.
I agree that that's a way, but I just want to say I often notice people when they talk about strategy, people often go, "This is the way. I have the way to accomplish whatever." And I think almost all the time there are probably many things we can do to influence it. And to me, that's one of the things exciting about looking at the root level of objectives, because the deeper you go, the more different things you find can contribute to that one thing. So the CEO pay, for example, and in general our focus on inequality, one of our root issues is more equality, and some people get all freaked out when you say equality because they think you mean exactly the same pay for everybody. Yeah, everybody gets the same size house. And the same. Okay, so that's not what we mean. We necessarily. Probably most of us mean something more like equity, something that's reasonable and fair. That if there is a difference in the resources that different people have, it's not crazy out of whack like it's become. So I think that's a good example of a root level issue, more equity that kind of is vague and nebulous, and yet like certainly I want that, and a lot of our issues could come, and campaigns ideas could come down to that.
So then, looking at, I guess one proposal I would make in trying to make productive use of this time is, if we look at the root level objective for the B of A campaign, for instance, I can take notes on ways that people might suggest to improve it, or maybe there are parts in this little box that people don't necessarily agree with it as describing a root objective. Maybe we can try to refine a root level objective, and of course, we'll take it back to Fergus and Jean's here. And obviously, ultimately, it will be up to all of Occupy to, put the final frosting on any of these words. Whatever campaign we choose, it will be up to the movement to come up with actual campaign plans and work plans and, you know, kind of solidify the language on it, but the ones that we at least have some information, it might be a little hard to flesh out equal work, for instance, you know, without more input from Jeremy, since it was his proposal, but at least in looking at the B of A one, root level objective to build public awareness of the corrupt and damaging nature of the operations, et cetera, John just kind of laid out, you know, how that might be problematic or how it might not necessarily be a root level objective per se. And so I'm wondering if people have any suggestions on how we might phrase the root level objective for the B of A, and I'll kind of take minutes on it and we can kind of maybe integrate that into the spreadsheet before the next session.
Great idea, Warren.
So, you know, I was twinkling my hand as John was talking, because before he said that, I was thinking the same thing, community control over our finances, our economy. And once you have that root level, you know, I consider it to be a root level issue. Once you have that in place, then you can think about, like, you know, do we want like a special community credit union where everybody gets a lot more say than a typical credit union? And you can start working on the state bank, and it really can go in like any kind of direction, but really you want that core issue framed in that way to get people thinking and coming up with their own solutions.
And so community control of financial systems?
Well, I would say like the economy, I guess is how I would put it.
Jamil, was that an appropriate use of the word economy?
Oh, yeah. Just when you talk about democracy and the economy, some people get really wary of that idea. I don't, personally.
So, community control of the economy as a root level objective for the B of A campaign. Any other thoughts or ideas?
That's for the B of A campaign?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it means. When you say like
to be more explicit, you could say social control. And by social control, that means democratic control.
but when you say our economy, like, and I have no problem with exploring this in principle, you know, I don't know if this is what you're referring to, but some people would think that meant government ownership of all industry. You know, I don't know if that's what is meant by saying community control over economy or not, or if it just means community control over core financial institutions, you know, such as a central bank and so on, which in some sense, some people would argue we have, right? But
it's a really common argument, actually, in reference to banks, and it was the big discussion when the financial crisis was happening, was the nationalization of the banks. So yes, I think in the most explicit sense, it's nationalization of the banks. Now, that has happened in several countries already, and it's definitely, you know, not just like some screwball off on the edge idea.
yeah.
So I don't think that, I mean, that said, it's also associated with socialism or communism or whatever. But
And then I want to point out that if you state that as the root level objective, it doesn't address at all the question that Madeline pointed us to of having more local control versus national control. So do we even want, you know, to have one, you know, giant institution at the federal level that's making all these decisions versus a bunch of more local institutions? You know, and maybe we want both. I mean, there's a principle called subsidiarity, which rather than saying everything should be local and everything should be central, just says everything should be decided at the level that's most appropriate.
I think that's a great way to put it.
So, Art and Reed.
I'm just not certain as to what practical difference in our campaign it would make whether we're having national or local control of the banking situation, assuming that happens at the end of our 6-month campaign. But,
well, the goal would be to articulate root level objectives that we're going to keep doing campaigns on. Some of them will be 6-month campaigns.
I don't think we need to be that specific as to
I
about which level of government should be controlling a reformed banking system.
We are in early days in working this stuff out.
Yeah.
But I think it's helpful for us to at least make an attempt to come up with a root level objective that we might actually still be working on. 2 years from now, 3 years from now.
All right.
And then the benefit of articulating it now is people have been hearing from Occupy for 2 or 3 years that here's this thing we want, and over time we've done education and smaller scale actions that start to get them to buy into it, and we get more and more support and move closer to it. Now, we may realize 2 or 3 campaigns down the road, oh, you know, that root level of objective we identified the first time, that really didn't, you know, get something that we really want, but we learned from it and we adjusted as time goes by.
Are we-
Just point of process real quick. That it would be unfortunate if we didn't get to every one and try to re-articulate. So maybe we can try to be specific about what we would add or subtract or how we re-articulate it. But since people actually fill it out other than the Bank of America, I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah, that was
Let's do
actually,
read and then we can move on to the
yeah,
next.
that's
Or
what I was
Michael,
gonna say,
sorry.
we just wanna list what we think and not go into the debate about those. And when I was saying community, I meant really local to Eugene, not on a national level. But yeah, I agree with Jamil, I think it'd be better if we just throw the ideas out and we'll not debate them, leave the debate till later.
How about
Respecting that, I won't, you know.
Okay. Anybody else have ideas to throw out regarding the objective route for the B of A campaign?
Break up the too big to fail parts.
You think that's a route objective?
Yeah,
Break up the 2 big banks.
too big to fail.
Now, I'm an historian, and I gave Lauren a bibliography, and my bibliography really goes back prior to 6000 BC, and we can trace how money worked going forward to this day. And if we understand how money works, how banks got so big that if they fail, they pull down the whole economy. Then we have, it's like an old building, which we know is tottering. So what's good in that old building that we want to take forward? And what new building do we make that's way better and suits our current 21st century needs? But I don't think we get where we want to go in terms of route unless we're willing to take an historical perspective, and Lauren has put my bibliography up. So anybody who wants to go historical, I'd love to talk with you.
All right. So any other suggestions on the B of A route level objective before we move on to the next campaign? Okay, so the equal work campaign, unfortunately, we weren't able to, really communicate with Jeremy before tonight to get a bunch of details or get his hit on what he thought the route level objective was. Either John or somebody on the committee, does anybody feel comfortable trying to throw one out, or should we maybe just move on to the next campaign?
I'm gonna look at his proposal right now. Why don't you go on to the next one and I'll
Okay.
try to come back.
So the next one was the Campaign for Homeless Solutions, and the route level objective maybe wasn't necessarily articulated in that framework. Instead, they listed a long-term goal to have a better society, to end greed and corruption, an intermediate goal to develop community land trusts to provide housing by reclaiming the commons, and a short-term goal of a village or villages where the homeless can legally exist and stay dry to be opened before this winter. So in terms of the route level objective, again, I think kind of going back to what Reed articulated for our homes over Wall Street, to me it seems like the route level objective, once again, is housing as a human right.
Yes.
Does anyone see any other route level objectives for the Campaign for Homeless Solutions different from that?
Well, I think part of it, I wouldn't say about end greed and corruption. I don't think we're ever going to do that. Maybe manage it better, but I would have spoken more, I think, about housing for everyone. We may be starting with homeless, the most explicit inequity, but I want to know why somebody making $25,000 a year can't buy a home for $75,000. That's decent. You know, when we talked last week, I think.
Well, so rather than pontificating about the issues in depth, don't forget,
So
we're just
it would
trying to
be-
focus on the root.
It would be housing reform as well.
Housing as a human right, and you would want to add as a root objective housing reform.
Well, or, I mean, stated differently, like affordable housing,
Yeah.
right?
Affordable.
That's usually how it goes under, but I actually like the idea of housing reform because I think you're getting to even a deeper issue there, which is the inflationary prices and whatnot, but that's a complicated issue, I would say.
But
And that word reform is a real loaded word.
Which is happening usually, there's Metropole, and there's St. Maine, Netco, and then there's on a more local level, like the Blair Co-op housing unit there.
now that's very interesting, the Blair Co-op housing, and eco housing. But the thing is, I'm not talking about subsidized housing. I'm talking about housing that people can afford without being subsidized. Why should the average house cost $150,000?
Well, you're getting to a deeper issue there about income,
Right.
which I think is the really interesting thing when we talk about the homeless solutions. The thing that really irks me about it is that it always feels like abandoned. Like if I'm a homeless person, yeah, I want a place to live, but if I've not given any way to sustain myself over time, that's another issue. It's kind of like to give a man a fish or teach him how to do it, right? I mean, that's the real problem I see with the core objective there. And frankly, I also think it's an issue with foreclosures.
Yep.
Well, what about the second root objective in foreclosure, which I think could apply to the idea of us, the community, saying that the city of Eugene should make some land available for homeless people, community control over land.
Yeah.
I don't think that addresses, I don't think that addresses the issue of income, but it does a little more in the direction of, I guess in a way, both of those issues, if you want to go even deeper, which as I said you always can, is, are we actually going to care for each other?
Yeah, but we're talking about a root objective.
Yeah.
A little more practical, but I see what you're saying.
Go back a bit.
Yeah, so in the housing is a human right / community control over land, you get the community control over land through these community land trusts, and when you put house and land in those land trusts, the price is dramatically cheaper, so it's more affordable. That's where the economics come in.
And land trusts are not the only mechanism to accomplish that too. That's just the easy example to give, the one that's been tried. Okay.
So bring back, we have two things now in this.
So right now for a root level objective, I wrote down housing as a human right, affordable housing and reform. But do we want to add community control over land to this campaign as a root objective as well?
The community land trust, the rest of it I agree with.
Yeah.
It's just the first sentence of saying we need to refine.
They overlap, they do, in what's listed now.
So instead of affordable housing and reform, we should just put community control over land as well. Okay. Then, looking at our homes over Wall Street, I think that we've got the root level objectives, obviously, partially because we had just had a very well-trained speaker and organizer come and kind of deliver that sermon to us. But housing as a human right, control over land as the root level objectives. Excuse my dog children. Does anybody see any other root level objectives or anything different than that that should be added or not to that?
I just wanted to offer a criticism. I think that, I don't know if anyone has studied what CLTs are and what that means in terms of organization. And, one of the things Max Ramos said that people may have missed, or I'm not sure people understood, but, essentially, he actually used the term trans-local network or something like that to describe the amount, like the organizations that we're affiliated with take back the land. And he even mentioned, you know, an arm, like a separate group that deals with, you know, like the legal, like the civil disobedience part of it, that has legal connections to the legal community and whatnot. And then I imagine that there would even be another part of it that would have to deal with CLTs, because you have to have nonprofit status to be able to establish those.
You can also be an LLC.
Okay, you can also be an LLT. But my point in bringing it up is that that's a pretty sophisticated level of organization. You're getting yourself into a very, you know, it's a complicated, time-consuming kind of project, right? And you know, when you do a foreclosure defense at this stage, you know, I know it's a goal, but as soon as you do a defense, and if you win that goal, then you're immediately presented with the problem of like potentially setting up a land trust. And I can guarantee you it's not an easy process. In addition to that, I'm just not convinced of that as an objective, as a root level objective. I mean, I have several different criticisms of it, but again, it goes back to, you know, you're basically, Max argued that you take the equity from that home, that someone may have put some of that equity into the home to begin with, right? But then they're getting foreclosed on, and then you're putting it into the land trust. That right there is just a very difficult, you know, like he was talking about picking the right people to potentially, you know, bring into that process. He was talking about, you know, several different ways that they had done it, and I could just, I mean, to me, it could really take us far afield from the kind of, again, Occupy Wall Street kind of issues, and again, I bring it back to inequality. It's like, you know, yeah, we're getting something back from the banks, but what are we getting for people, you know? I mean, what are we doing, you know, about unemployment? What are we doing about helping people sustain that, even if it's a land trust? I mean, even a land trust is going to have expenses. Even if you do get all the principal in those homes. So
We just find all the projects.
yeah, so I actually think the foreclosures is a very, very good campaign. But I personally have not come up myself with how would I articulate the objective, just because I'm a little bit concerned about what that involves, and I think it really gets us into a, you know, I don't know, maybe someone else who's part of, you know, a community organization could speak to it. I don't know. Maybe I'm making it more complicated than it is.
Keep people in their homes, maybe, as part of the root
You're
objective.
making it less complicated. I just have material from Canada, and what they're working towards is a Community Ecosystem Trust Facilitation Act. Now that involves a whole lot of how we manage
Public lands.
scarce resources and how to keep renewable resources renewable, which none of us have talked about. But I'm going to talk with Tim Carmack, and if you want a presentation at some point as to how we could develop legally a legal structure within which we could legally have land trust. And I don't understand it in enough detail, but it's another approach from what you're talking about. And as I understand it, you can build it for self-sustaining. But again, I just have read this one time. I haven't read it with someone who understands this stuff better. And I would like to have a presentation at some point, because it's like a far, far goal. Because you're right, it's very complicated. But if you understand that there's land that should be in the public domain, which we control, and not this move toward privatization, which is part of our problem. That, you know, instead of national banks, we're having the opposite, that both the bank and the corporations are becoming the government.
Some would argue there, yeah.
Okay, so
Okay,
that's
so
the opposite of what we want.
I just want to articulate mine differently. The way I would think about changing it is just to say the strategic objective, the root level objective would be to stop as many illegal foreclosures as possible, potentially not using the principal whatever. but that as a root level objective. And I think it may not sound weird to people, but my idea there is that, you know, the root level objective may not be that achievable. Maybe none of these are that achievable. Maybe they should be a little bit more achievable, and maybe for our purpose is to build the movement as one of our prime goals. Just making those connections and doing those actions that are winnable actions as we've proven.
But a root level objective isn't necessarily what you are aiming to win in a 6-month campaign plan, right? It's sort of more
that's not
like your
necessarily
long
6 months. That may be long term. I mean, the housing crisis is deepening. It's going to be going on for years. And it's going into, as was pointed out, it's going into another cycle here of foreclosures. We're actually on the cusp of another huge cycle of foreclosures that really never ended from 2007. And it's going to go again because they actually inflated housing values again, because that was the only thing that they could think to do. So anyway, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily just a 6-month objective anyway.
But whether it's 6 months or 2 years, I think when we say here's a campaign to achieve something, then I think we want to make it, you know, very winnable, kind of in our sight, whether our sight is 6 months or 2 years or 5 years. But to me, the value of articulating a root level objective that we don't know how long or how or when we're going to achieve it is to, you know, have some messaging that really goes to the heart, that ties together a lot of different things. So I mean, that's why, you know, before at some point I said, oh, we could go deeper. Do we care about each other? Like to me, that's a very fundamental thing. A lot of people go, well, what? That's not achievable, or we're not going to get that within 6 months or whatever. But when I think about the kind of world I want to live in, I think, wow, if this were a society where we all really, everybody agreed, we want that, and we're going to have all of our institutions and everything reflect that, that would change everything about our society. So, you know, I'm totally with picking winnable campaigns that we go, this is going to happen in 6 months or 2 years. I just think there's also value, you know, in articulating these things that are less like that.
How about moving people back into their, I mean, people should be able to keep their homes. People should be able to stay in their homes. That should be an objective. Their foreclosed homes.
That's subsumed into the...
Well,
I kind of want to point out that if you're talking about root level objectives, then perhaps theoretically what should be happening is that we should be arriving at the same root level objective for every one of these campaigns.
That's what I was just going to point out.
If it is in fact a root level objective, and maybe John's proposed root level objective is a really good one, or it's a good starting point, but I don't think necessarily knowing the root level objective in the sense of one that is universal to all of these problems is going to help you work on any particular one of them.
Yeah.
I think the deeper you go in a way, the less helpful it is.
Exactly.
I mean, if you say we want everybody to care about each other, that doesn't tell you much of anything about how any of these look.
And
but there's intermediate things like housing as a human right that do start to give you more specifics. So there's really more than the 2 levels of campaign objective and root level of objective. There's kind of a whole a bunch of things in between that you can talk about. And I think the important thing is to pick one, you know, that has enough breadth that there's a bunch of different actions we might take, or different campaigns we might undertake over time that continue to hit that level.
These are campaign root level objectives, so they are specifically on that level of the campaign, and the campaigns are articulated. They have their targets and everything, right?
But over time, I would expect us to run many campaigns that have housing as a human right.
Aren't you getting a little ahead of yourself? We're trying to figure out something about these particular campaigns. We know that each campaign is actually leading to a larger, broader goal. And believe me, I could articulate one as well.
Okay.
But I do agree with you that it becomes very diffuse.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful about that.
Yeah. I'm not for going as deep as possible all the time. I'm for going to a depth that is useful.
Well, and I think it's important to remember how Max was using these objectives during his presentation. You know, the idea is to be able to take any particular action or tactic and be able to link it back to your larger objective. if it doesn't fit within that larger objective, you shouldn't be doing it as part of that campaign. And so he was saying how he was able to eliminate certain things, like putting a single family back in their house just to put the family back in the house, because that didn't help them reach their goal of housing as a human right or community control over the land by having a single individual family saved, from their particular foreclosure crisis. So I think that before we get too deep into the philosophical issue of what is a root level objective, I think we should keep our focus on the practicality of how it was used during that presentation, because I think that's why it's important for this discussion. And Jessica, did you have to?
Yeah, going back to something Janelle said, so there's a whole other line in the spreadsheet about 6-month campaign objectives. So assuming we want to come up with 6-month campaign objectives, then the root level objectives would at least be some more distant level than the 6-month campaign objectives, even if we don't go to the deepest thing like how do we save humanity. Somewhere beyond the 6-month campaign objectives.
Did somebody have their
Yeah, just a point of clarification in Max's. I mean, I saw when he was on Bill Moyers, and when I saw moving families into their homes, and what I came away with is that he's still moving families into their homes, but it's not like they're living there, they're kind of squatting. I mean, it's illegal still, but it's the broader context that he's putting in, that it's a human right. Housing is a human right, is what he's standing on. So, has he gotten to that level of actually setting up the land trust?
Yeah.
Okay,
But
because
not,
we have, like we have Alprovecho and San Diego, places that have done the land trust, and I've seen that model fall apart as well.
Yeah.
I think it's complicated with people.
that's what I'm going from, because that's what I studied. I studied eco-villages in Oregon.
I mean, I think that, I guess what I would say is, if this is chosen as one of our campaigns, then we have these in-depth assessments and discussions, and all of those details are going to be important to put on the table as we flesh out an actual campaign plan and our vision for that campaign and what we want to do and not do with a given campaign.
But it says in here that housing is a human right, community control over the land, and applies to community land trusts. So, I mean, I think it's relevant. It's a relevant discussion.
Sure.
But I gave a completely different idea, like I said. I don't know, no one responded to it, but just stopping as many foreclosures as possible.
That's implicitly a part of it.
I know it's implicitly a part of it. I realize that.
Part of the root cause
This is a
listed.
6 month.
But think about it. Think about it. So when you do community control of the land, in some ways you're glossing over, in a sense, the depredations of the banks and how this really happened. And we know it happened through predatory lending and stuff like that. And so when you stay on that plane, you link directly to one of the goals of OWS, and you're making a very clear, a clear direction, a clear set of things to do. And I think the assumption that we're actually going to get to the root level objective is it can be a little restrictive in itself, because when you think of a community land trust, I don't think that addresses the bigger issue of inequality and why people, with what's happening with our economy, that there's this situation.
It doesn't have to be a community land trust. It says community control over land.
That's what I was just going to say. It could be occupying the commons, tent villages.
But all of those, what does that mean? That's totally diffuse to me. That means none of those things that you...
It is, and Max referenced that when he gave his talk. He said, we don't know exactly what that looks like here.
Right.
And I think it's going to take us a while to figure out what it looks like, because we're all completely steeped in the world as we have it, and a few of the alternatives that we've seen, or read about elsewhere. I think what we end up with is going to look completely different from any the most brilliant proposal somebody has right now. All we can do is look ahead at what's the next step that we all do agree on.
That's what I'm arguing for.
Yeah, and so right, and so what I'm hearing is we probably have a lot of agreement around stopping foreclosures, And then there's an edge where we're not in as much agreement yet. And what would we like to happen when we stop a foreclosure? And some people are like, I'm happy if the people get their home back. And other people are like, well, hey, let's try an experiment of community land trusts and see how that goes. And it's like, we'll figure that out as we go along. For this campaign, we will want to answer, possibly before we pick it, whether we're going to only do these defenses with families that are saying, yeah, I think I'd be open to this, to my house.
Just as an example, maybe part of your campaign is to present that idea to the people that we're helping to win foreclosures for, helping to defend their foreclosure, right? And you say, look, this is an idea that people have done. If you want to try to do it, here's some models, we'll do it. But you see what I'm saying is that when you put your organizational energy into that component of this particular campaign, it's a major investment, I guess is what I'm saying, right? So I'm just trying to make us aware of that. And it's relevant to this particular proposal, but I also think it's relevant to other ones as well. Like, for example, homeless action. Who's gonna run those places? Is it gonna be OE people?
I think this, do you want me to answer that?
Sure.
Or do you want to do that in a later time? Okay, the idea right now is that it will not be an Occupy camp. It will involve people from Occupy in collaboration with community people setting up a 501c3 as oversight. And we need that in order to get donations because it's an expensive process.
But won't the primary control of the community in many ways be in the hands directly of the people who live there?
Yes.
Okay.
That's
Management.
Yes.
It's an oversight and a financial, you need some financial form. And we want this to be sanctioned rather than
Renegade.
illegal. Because that way the people have a sense that, they can't be thrown out of their homes tomorrow, but also you can't make an investment in preparing the site if it can be overturned at any time.
So, do you remember when we had our site and this thing dawned upon everybody there that the people that were taking care of the site were the people that were living there? And that happened almost like the second day we were at the park lots. It occurs to me that the workers' cooperative idea is actually much more compatible than creating a nonprofit with what you're suggesting. Because what you're suggesting, in a sense, is that it's self-sustaining.
Yes.
And who better to self-sustain it than the people living there, right?
Well,
Well, there is a
Is that
C3
true?
model that is a workers' circle. You can have a nonprofit 501c3 that works as a workers' circle. League of Wilderness Defenders is a good example of an existing one, so it's certainly totally possible.
Yeah, and that sounds very good and something that we would look into, would be looked into.
Okay, well, so we've got 15 minutes left and 2 more proposals to look at. Can we move forward just to at least touch on them and check out the root cause level objectives for them as well?
Nope.
Okay. Back to the sensitive foreclosure campaign.
So these are actually ones that I pulled from looking at Ruth's thing.
Okay.
So I didn't know if they would articulate, because there's an existing alliance that's already working on this, and it's just asking us to join in with them. So I didn't know whether the single-payer healthcare system in Oregon was what they thought of as a root-level objective, or healthcare as a human right, which I know that they've talked about, and they've actually had an Occupy DA, assert that healthcare as a human right. But those seemed like obvious things. And then the 6-month campaign objective, I did get a quote from it. They have a specific resolution, and a quote from the written proposal was to get the resolution passed in as many communities as possible. Obviously, the long-term goal is very explicit for that campaign, which is to get single-payer healthcare in the state of Oregon. But obviously, that's not going to happen within 6 months. I think their timeline is to get that on the 2014 for all of us to vote on it. So I don't know what their, that was the best I could come up with.
I think that's accurate.
Yeah, I think it's really accurate too.
Okay.
in these
Yeah, that
discussions.
sounds like a long shot in terms of being a campaign for Occupy in my mind, so I don't know. I mean, I strongly believe in it, but because there are so many other groups working on it already, I think those people who are interested in putting their energy behind it are probably already plugged into that coalition work. But does anybody have any other like discussion or proposals for other root level objectives that I think?
I just wanted to make a comment. Like, I was talking with Karen about this, and she made a really good point that our healthcare system is really fucked up. And this is like, we want this healthcare system available for everyone. And really, what we should be thinking about is that we want health for all. We want a new system that actually heals people, not gives them drugs and surgeries and cuts them open and destroys people, but we want a new kind of health system. We want health for all.
Healthy
And so I thought that was a
communities.
really interesting point.
Well, one thing that I've thought of, and I was hoping to put out a campaign proposal, but I think the largest umbrella of economics, environmental, and ethics is energy. What sources of energy we're going to choose for our future. And we're fighting, you know, up there, we're splitting hairs every step of the way. We're still drilling, we're still blasting, we're still bringing
Fracking.
coal through. And, you know, and that's what's really destroying our health. And to me, it's like without a healthy planet, we don't have healthy people. So it's really large, the healthcare system. And I mean, I believe in preventative healthcare overall. I don't want to see people taking drugs to patch themselves back together. And, you know, I mean, if we had an ideal world, I'd want to reverse everything and go back towards a clean planet if we could. But unfortunately, what we're facing is a paradigm shift, the greatest paradigm shift on Earth. And how can we make that quantum leap when we're up against, you know, this urgency of time?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how that gets the health. Not that you were necessarily trying to get to the healthcare for all thing, but I actually just have to agree with Lauren. I think as a root level objective, it's probably the clearest, the most direct that there is in this spreadsheet. So I wouldn't really propose anything to change it. My main question again would be to subject it to the principles that we have. I think it's actually a great thing to build potential solidarity around. But as a practical matter, my assessment of the last 2 decades of fighting for this particular issue is that it is a very, very entrenched, difficult battle that, you know, even the people that are championing the big win in Massachusetts, I think it was, Vermont, right, or conditional, I would say. And it was an 11-year battle, to my understanding, or struggle. So I think that I actually spoke to Ruth, and what I told her is that what I think Occupy's role in a campaign like this would be to be a strategic ally, so that when, for example, we want to go to the legislature, that Occupy is committed to round up as many bodies as possible to go down there. You know, I could think of that, but as a campaign proposal for Occupy, I just didn't.
I agree.
Well, it's interesting for me, you know, the title of the campaign, Healthcare for All, when I first thought of it, I thought of our medical committee, and I thought of, you know, how can it somehow tie into the campaign for homeless solutions, you know, something like housing and healthcare as a human right, with the idea being that, you know, people should not be forced to rot on the streets and then head to the emergency room in desperado situations, because they, you know, never get to eat healthy and, you know, live in extreme environments and stuff like that. So I guess one thing that, you know, I would potentially like to see in evolving with the campaign for homeless solutions is, you know, how can we integrate that medical committee into that long-term vision of the village, to kind of at least bring healthcare as an issue for people who are at the very, very bottom rung of the ladder.
How does Occupy New York integrate this issue with the healthcare issue? How do they see it as part of their campaign?
Well, I think their campaigns focus on the corporations that manage healthcare. Pfizer and the giant insurance companies and those types of corporate issues. Okay, well, so then I guess let's just move on to the last one. In any minutes we have left at the end, we can go back and talk about other things too. So the Community Bill of Rights, which was a big laundry dream list, I think, of a lot of different social justice issues. And the root level objective was framed as, the main objective is to provide a framework for most of the social injustices in the community by focusing on human rights, the rights of nature, and housing, healthcare, and an end to corporate personhood. So, how do you frame the root level objective to that one?
I feel like that kind of hits one of two possible root level of objectives in that. I think what way I read it, what it's saying is it gives us at a community level an opportunity to articulate with the force of law a bunch of our fundamental, principles. So it is a way of bringing together a bunch of root level objectives, and I hope, whether this gets selected or not, that it initiates a conversation among us, maybe to submit, down the road for another campaign. For those of us who enjoy getting down to these root, how we articulate these root level things. But I think there's a whole second objective to it that I didn't seem to articulate, but it's what I understand is part of this whole Community Bill of Rights movement, from talking with some of the people involved in it, which is to establish local government's control, the ability to legislate against what corporations are wanting. Corporations, go to court right now and assert a whole bunch of things under, as if they were persons. And a lot of communities that are passing bills, that restrict them are not getting, sued. The corporations are not going around them.
But they're also not enforceable.
They're not. Eventually, there will be court cases that determine what happens with it. But the corporations are scared enough of doing that they aren't pushing hard yet. My guess is because they know that if they do, they're just going to give publicity to it, and then there's going to be hundreds of communities across. There already are in Pennsylvania. They're pretty much ready to go at the state level in Pennsylvania to do this. But they know they would just give publicity to it, and then they're going to face court cases all over the country on this. So I don't think we know yet how it will play out legally, but I think either it will play out well legally, and we will basically, if it succeeds, see a groundswell of local legislation that asserts local communities' power over corporations, or at the very least, it will raise, gigantic public awareness that, hey, we've lost our rights to these corporations, and might build a lot of support for a federal solution like the undoing corporate personhood.
Well, my only comment to that is, my understanding from the ALEC work that I do is that the reason the corporations aren't reacting is because these little local ordinances have no teeth and no enforcement, and they're just continuing to do whatever they want. And a city council can pass this resolution and make a handful of people feel good, but it really doesn't have any enforceability because the way the law works, federal law trumps, especially when you get down to the local level. The city of Eugene is not going to tell Monsanto it can't come sell fertilizer here. Well, they can say it, but it's not going to happen.
Then we need to do more research, because from what I've read, it sounded to me, and this is information I'm getting from the people who, support this, but my understanding was that there were a lot of places where corporations are not, breaking the local ordinances. Now, those are the issue-specific ordinances. There are very few communities that have passed this kind of broad community bill of rights, but the ones that are targeted, things like fracking, or whatnot, my understanding was that corporations were not just going ahead and doing it.
Yeah.
But it sounds like we need to learn more.
Yeah, well, I know it's a background on this. This is something that I worked on a little bit in Michigan. These ideas come out of an organization called POCLAD, Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy. They were first passed in Pennsylvania in targeting hog farms. And they stopped hog farms from locating in certain communities because they contaminated groundwater. Just totally nasty, of course, for the community. My understanding is that it did indeed stop them from locating in those particular areas. Then it was extended to genetic engineering, and then it was extended to a few other areas, actually having significant economic impacts. Because Program on Corporations and Law and Democracy was one of the major organizations that was trying to promote the end of corporate personhood, which is why that's also a part of this. And so this is one of the ways that they were battling that. But all that said, this reminds me of something that Howard Zinn writes about in People's History of the United States. He was talking about, I think it was in the 1920s, 19-teens, when some municipalities didn't just want to stop corporations from doing certain economic activity. They wanted to go further, like this Community Bill of Rights kind of implies. And like say there was an issue with ice and ice delivery for refrigerators. At that time they just had ice blocks. And so there was a socialist mayor that was elected. And they wanted to basically make the whole ice system a city-run business that was democratically run. That was something that they sourced to local labor and everything like that, and they wanted to control that because it was a necessity for the community to keep their food supply from spoiling. And that kind of thing, when it started, was immediately shut down. And my understanding now is that there is judicial, there's judicial history. There's a whole bunch of legal precedent that makes it impossible to go any further, I think, than some of these ordinances do. So it's a really complex issue, and I'm kind of getting at what Lauren is saying from a different angle, and just pointing out that this is like it's got a broad, it's nice because it's got this umbrella, but I definitely question the kind of practicality of it, and what I see is a lot of things being articulated, and I'm having trouble trying to figure out what we'd specifically do. Maybe it is a corporate personhood ordinance. Those are a big deal in some places.
Well, what about as root level objectives I threw out, end corporate dominance, restore community control of resources?
That's just good. That's what I'm saying, though. There's a major contradiction there, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're not. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that that's viable as a campaign or anything like that, but in terms of trying to encapsulate what the root objectives are of a community bill of rights, it seems to be, those two broad things with a lot of subcategories within them. Okay, well, it's 8:28 right now. Any further questions or discussion about any of the, it doesn't have to necessarily be about root level objectives, but are there any other questions about any of the information on this spreadsheet or our strategic planning process, or one thing that we didn't really get to that I hope people will try to focus on over the next few days before our next GA is looking at the categories, how many occupiers are needed to win a mini victory and how many occupiers are needed to achieve the 6-month campaign, and give us your own assessments of what those numbers are. The numbers that you see in the spreadsheet were either taken from the proposals or the proposalee, suggested them, but I think that some of them are a little bit dubious, I guess, my own personal opinion on some of them. But, I think, again, going back to earlier in today's session, I think the primary honest discussion and analysis that we really need to have with ourselves is what is our capacity and what is our potential realistic capacity in the very near future to be able to, build these campaigns. And, one other thing I just want to point out on that issue, that, that the Back to the Land movement and Max's presentation and campaign, that is the only campaign that they do. They have over 100 people in his, local locale working on it, let alone the other, trans-local groups that are working on it. And so, when we're thinking about capacity, and they've been working on it for years now, so for us to take on what he's been doing and then add some other things on, would potentially be really difficult to do, I think, in my opinion. So
I think a key part is the coalition work. There's also the steps being allies that can provide a lot of the power and bodies that we need to move forward to the key stage in terms of the planning these campaigns.
And that was something that was asked for in the original written campaign. And we can, over time expand this spreadsheet so that it's easy to compare those kinds of things.
Yeah, I just wanted to, just for the benefit of the live stream and just so people understand, I would suggest they definitely think this should be submitted to the OEC contacts list, this spreadsheet, and the notes that Lauren took. And I think this is a great way to launch the discussion in the GA, which can be a little bit unwieldy sometimes. I hope people understand that this is not, an exclusive discussion. This is kind of being had for the purpose of expanding and deepening the discussion that actually happens in the GA where we decide this. And any decisions that we make about timeframes and whatnot, of course, can be changed. But we've opted for, at least in the Legal Research Committee, extending the process a little bit because it's obviously shown its fruits. Lots of really good discussions, not just here, the different GAs, and just try to get this material in people's hands. I think would be helpful as we send it out. We'll try to send it out as soon as possible to the email lists and then post it on the website.
I want to say also, I don't know if anything will come of this. I wanted to bring it up at the legal research meeting, but didn't get a chance to. But I think it might be really good for us to have a better online space, or some kind of online space. We don't really have one other than the existing mailing list and so on. So I'll talk with you about that.
We have crabgrass, but it's not a nice.
Better space. or there. Yeah.
Okay, so next week's training session is on how to build power through using the political system. Michael is going to lead that training, and it's going to not only involve like how to use the, what is the city council, how does our city government work, so that people can have a little bit better orientation on how things actually push, where there is leverage points for pushing against the political system, how best to advocate your issues if you're choosing to engage in that process, why people choose to engage in that process, what it can gain, and what its deficits might be, as well as what were the other parts we talked about? How to
Well, there's some different options, how to talk about that. We the people decided to go get it, their resolution passed the council, establishing we've done something along those lines against the wars as well, but looking at, okay, what to be accomplished by doing that, how do you, the different ways of going through the working process. Yes, and also the key thing is relationship building, how to do that. And if you're going to do the political process, that is a key thing in terms of otherwise you're. So, other ideas like that, but also I'm hoping to be able to say, how do we use that in some of the campaigns we just talked about? How do we use that in the weeks and months ahead? So, just what I'm interested in.
Yeah, well, I would say that in all of the campaigns that we have, there will be a component, some humans that will need to be invested in those processes.
And so I'm also going to have a meeting with Kitty Piercy to see what does she think is effective. So we have some of that information.
She was big on coalition building, I remember.
Yeah, so I'll get some info. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all.
Thank you all.
And it'll be good. So everything.